Support for the Nonprofit Lab comes from realistic optimism, the ability to balance out negative and positive things in situations, circumstances, and people. It is the courage to explore opportunities where others might be blocked by risk and failure, with the belief that the future will be better than the past. Realistic optimism. Look on the upside, but not in an obnoxiously positive way. Welcome to the Nonprofit Lab, a podcast dedicated to the ongoing discovery of how we can all be a bigger part of social change through the lens of the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Puya Porak. I'm an industrial engineer, human-centered designer, and CEO of MatchNice, a social impact tech startup with a mission to connect the nonprofit ecosystem and maximize social impact. Thanks for joining us on our startup journey as we look to uncover and shake up the status quo in the world of nonprofits. Today's guest is our first returning guest, the esteemed Dr. Laura Otten. She's the founder and director of LaSalle University's Master of Science in Nonprofit Leadership and a tenured member of LaSalle's faculty. She was the executive director of LaSalle's Nonprofit Center from 2001 through May of 2021 and brings over 50 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. As you'll hear towards the end of this episode, I actually wasn't planning for our conversation to be an episode for the Nonprofit Lab. Laura is just one of our key advisors for MatchNice, and I was recording this call to share with my co-founders. But as you'll hear at the end of the episode, I thought her feedback was just too good to not share. In this episode, I run through a variety of status quo practices in the nonprofit sector that we've been uncovering on our journey of discovery so far, and I wanted to get Laura's feedback on each one of them. As we came to find, every single one of these status quo practices boiled down to either being part of a scarcity mindset or an abundance mindset in the nonprofit sector. Things like fundraising, partnerships, mission delivery, technology adoption, and so much more. Here's my conversation with Laura. All right, Laura. Da-da-da.
Yeah, really.
So the purpose of this meeting, I really wanted to just get your thoughts on this point of view. And I admit, some of these things are not original. Actually, most of this isn't original. These are things that we know, but I think they're major themes that have come up as part of the ongoing discovery that me and the team have been doing in the nonprofit sector. And, you know, the theme is really around uncovering what the status quo practices are in the nonprofit sector and calling those things out and having a sense of direction for where things should move towards, not necessarily providing a prescriptive answer of exactly what needs to happen, but just saying, here's where we are, here's where maybe we should consider going. And I would love your thoughts and your feedback on this. So I have a handful, I'd say not a handful, two handfuls of these examples. So, you know, the title of the presentation is Breaking the Status Quo in the Nonprofit Sector. And, you know, this comes back to kind of the mission of MatchNice too, right? Like we're very interested and invested in being part of the wave and shifts that are happening from status quo to the future. So before I jump in, did you have any questions or anything? Okay, let's jump right in. So this is all based, of course, on our podcast and the market research that we're continuing to do. The first status quo, right, and I see you smiling, is mindset shifts, moving from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset. And there's like so many factors to this, right? It's fundraising, definitely, staffing and resources, partnerships, volunteering. There's just an overall scarcity mindset that is prevalent in the sector, and, you know, thinking about ways to kind of have the conversations and move towards this more abundance thinking. I think it's most loud when it comes to fundraising, but curious for your thoughts on on this one?
I mean, on the one hand, this is just so evident, and yet on the other hand, despite it being so evident, it is damn hard to break. I always say we are the best naysayers in the world. We are so quick to say we can't. The ability to even shift that mindset to think about, I'm not even going to talk about abundance. Let's just talk about a little bit more. It's just, it is so frustrating that I don't know. What are you asking me? I mean, it's so deeply rooted, and that until we can start making people understand that the myth of that it is a myth, this notion of having to have a scarcity mindset is a myth, not the reality. And that if we could get folks to start understanding that, we'd be good. I think about it in terms of the same shift we've had to accomplish, which was a hell of a lot easier, of getting people to understand that nonprofit didn't mean no profit, that nonprofits were businesses and had to operate like a business. And so I think the vast majority of folks have gotten that message. But at the same time, they'll talk about, yes, we recognize in the for-profit sector, you need money to make money, but they can't translate that into the nonprofit sector. And that's why they get stuck in this notion of scarcity mindset. And I think, and I have to couch it as I think, because I have never tested it. Not that I've thought about testing this, but it's not. That's not what I wanted to say. I think it's all tied in with the same failure to understand the concept of return on investment. Nonprofits don't get that concept, and until they get that concept, I think they're going to be stuck in the scarcity mindset. And I think they go hand in hand. Obviously, they go hand in hand, because if you're having a scarcity mindset, then you're not going to understand we have to find some resources that we can invest now, even though we're not going to see the immediate return that we want to see. But we recognize that the return that we're going to get down the road is going to be bigger and better because it will have shifted us. And so I think that and so what frustrates me is we've come to understand, most people have come to understand that we are in fact businesses and need to operate like businesses, but they haven't transferred from the for-profit sector to the nonprofit sector this understanding of the importance of return on investment, the importance of spending money to make money. And I don't think it is just in the area of fundraising. I mean, we see this in terms of technology. I mean, all of the organizations that did not invest in technology because they kept saying, we can't, we don't have, there's not going to be any immediate show in how our programs are doing, who were absolutely, frozen when the pandemic hit because their technology wasn't available for them to work virtually. They didn't have shared drives. They didn't have laptops. They didn't have, and the laptops they had didn't have video available. I mean, which if you think about it, how many years have computers come with built-in, audio, visual, whatever. But when you're using 10, 15-year-old stuff, so the scarcity mindset has hit in so many areas. I mean, we see it in, you've got staffing up there. Right now, so many nonprofits are struggling because they allowed their compensation. I don't even want to call them systems. That suggests there actually was a system. Their compensation determination, was so rooted in the scarcity mindset. Let's pay as little as we can. And let's not worry about quality so much. I mean, they would say they are, but to see how to invest in staffing. And now the small ones are really getting hit hard because they can't up the compensation. They're still struggling with the concept of bonuses, whether it's a hiring bonus, a retention bonus, a bonus period. So this scarcity mindset just permeates the whole sector, and it's going to continue to hold us back forever and ever and ever, unless we can pick it. Sorry. You touched it.
Don't apologize. And I hope that it isn't forever and forever
I
and
hope so
forever.
too.
And I love that you um underscored the importance of ROI as part of the shift. Like that's such an important factor. I mean, I just had a episode with someone who is a nonprofit website expert, and I was trying to dive into the challenges that um, nonprofits have in making that investment, and it's kind of helping the nonprofits shift the mindset from an expense to an investment, and seeing the ROI they can get from leads and all these other things, and you know, so I think everything that you're saying is very spot on, and also really helpful. And I think staff is, there's a lot of other things you touched on that I'm guessing are going to come up again as we go through some of these slides. But yeah, what I'm asking for is just your reactions to these things, a gut check to see like how on point are you know, is this kind of initial impression that we've gotten. And like I said, a lot of this stuff isn't new, but
Right. Totally deeply seated in the sector. This scarcity mindset drives me nuts. Drives me nuts. Sorry.
well, let's look at the next one. And
Yeah.
this is also kind of in the spirit of scarcity and abundance, is partnerships. And I'm realizing that nonprofits aren't always as collaborative with programming as I thought they would be. In fact, they can be hyper protective about what they perceive to be their IP or like their differentiator in providing a service. This competition versus collaboration is also especially true in fundraising. I think the importance of the shift that needs to happen here is because you know, if we're all genuinely interested in making a difference in the world, like, don't we want the best thing to be going on across our organizations? But you know, it's so much more complicated and complex than that. But you know, curious for your thoughts on this kind of moving from a competitive to a more collaborative partnership
So
approach.
I think this notion, I think there are internal myths, by which I mean there are myths that get perpetrated within the sector. And then there are external myths, these myths that those outside of the sector have about the sector. And one of them is that we're an altruistic sector. We are not an altruistic sector, unfortunately. Individuals are altruistic, but as a sector, we are not an altruistic sector at all, because if we were, you would not see this resistance to collaboration. You would not see the competition. You would see what you said and what I started to laugh at, not at you, but at what you were saying, that don't we all want the best? We want the best for us. Mergers, and I'm going to say mergers, the real thing, are not nearly as prevalent in the nonprofit sector as in the for-profit sector. Not because they don't make sense in the nonprofit sector, but given that most mergers in the for-profit sector are driven by benefit to the bottom line, that's not what motivates most nonprofits to merge, or to even think about merging. What generally motivates them is, oh my God, our executive director is retiring. What are we going to do? kind of stuff. So the way mergers happen in the nonprofit sector are not the methodical, thoughtful way they happen in the for-profit sector, though those of us who work in merging in the nonprofit sector are trying to work on that. But the reason I'm bringing up mergers is, I don't know what kills mergers in the for-profit sector. I mean, I have an idea, but I haven't looked at it the way I have in the nonprofit sector. But what kills the vast majority of mergers in the nonprofit sector is territory, and ego. Who's going to be the executive director? What's the name of the organization going to be? And it's this unimportant stuff. It's not, is this really going to be best for serving our clients? And so when I say we're not an altruistic sector, we are not, contrary to what we'd like everybody to think. Too few are thinking about what's going to be best for our client. They're thinking about, how do I keep my job? How do we keep our turf? How do we protect our egos? And so we are a very, very competitive society. I mean, let's just talk about fundraising. There is a zero-sum pie when it comes to the amount of money that's available. And that zero-sum pie seems to be shrinking while the number of folks who want a piece of that pie seems to be growing. We're going to be very, very competitive. When I say we're not altruistic, we don't share our secrets. Obviously, I'm talking in generalizations. I mean, there are some individuals, but I've had stories of people telling me that they were talking to a colleague at another organization about a grant that they were going for, and that person hadn't heard about it, went undercut them and got the grant. I mean, things that you would not think would be happening. We are not altruistic. I mean, the other way that I always look at us being altruistic, there are two ways that I look at us being, to look and see that we're not altruistic, that really bothers me. One is our willingness to invest in staff, because so many nonprofits are small. Too many executive directors and boards think about, well, if we invest in the professional development of this staff member, executive director thinking is, well, the only way that they're going to use that new information is to take my job. And I don't want them to take my job. And if I invest in them, therefore, and I don't want them to take my job, they're going to have to leave the organization. I don't want to invest in them. So there's not the let's make the sector stronger by investing in as many people as we can so that we're having good qualified people in the sector. It's no, only if it's going to benefit my organization. And this drives me nuts because it's a failure to understand that each individual organization and each individual employee, each individual nonprofit professional benefits from a stronger image, performance, whatever of the sector. Right. But we don't do that because we're not altruistic. And the other area is, this is a question that I've asked my master's students for as long as I've been teaching in the master's program, and I've asked of others as well. What is our responsibility as nonprofits who, going back to what you said, presumably exist to make the world a better place for everybody, even though our slice of the mission is here? But what is our responsibility to work for social justice issues that may not be directly tied to our mission, but are about making the world a better place for everybody? So if my mission is something in the environment, what is my responsibility as a nonprofit to be concerned about social justice issues? The sector has, and very quickly, embraced the whole DEIA, whatever you want to put the initials together, but so much of that was because there were funders' dollars behind it. And my point has always been, if you were really into this DEIA long before we put initials like that to it, you would have been working on it. It would have been evident in your core values. It would have been evident in what you do. And it just wasn't there.
Interesting. The thing I want to come back to real quick around the merger piece is, the shift that I'm proposing, it's not necessarily a merger. It's just collaboration, right? And, I was challenged by a nonprofit leader about this notion of like merging and like bigger is better, right? That's not always the case. Like, I think that was part of our conversation in the first podcast episode. Bigger is not always better. And actually, like, having smaller nonprofits be innovative and come up with new ways of delivering services and pushing the needle on social issues forward is wonderful. But it's the, like, can we partner together to make a greater impact as a whole? And I think you highlighted a lot of the obstacles to that and some of the uncomfortable truths that may be behind that as well.
So the collaboration piece, and I'm sorry I glossed over it, the hesitancy there is money. So, there was a period of time, and it's much quieter now, but there was a period of time where funders were very, very vocal about wanting to see proposals that were collaborations. But there always had to be a lead organization. The
Mm.
organization that was going to receive the money, the organization that would then redistribute the money, but the organization that would have to manage, and that costs money, and that costs time, resources. It costs a whole bunch of resources. And so oftentimes with collaboration, it was this question of money. Who was going to get more money? Who was going to be the lead organization, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
The other thing is that, this is a bigger issue and relates to what I said about mergers, is that mergers happen not because somebody has really done good due diligence and they've come and they've believed that a merger with another organization is going to make their services better. The same thing happens with collaboration, but they don't do the due diligence. So they end up going into a collaboration with an organization whose core values aren't the same thing, whose work ethic isn't the same thing, and very often collaborations are executive director driven rather than program staff driven, and the program staff don't get together. And so collaboration has taken on this, it's gotten tainted, I guess is the way I would put it, that it's less helpful and less beneficial than it should be. And I think it's in part due to the failure to find good collaborators and the failure to think about with whom or what they want to collaborate. And so they go with somebody who is the same rather than somebody who's complementary. To me, the collaboration should always augment the service that's being provided, rather, so if I can do this, it's not about abundance, it's about quality. Can we serve a bigger portion of the continuum? Can we serve a portion deeper rather than just more of?
Yeah, there's one of the founders that I interviewed, Stacy Saywin from Finability, digital first nonprofits focused on supporting and financially empowering survivors of domestic violence, is a great example of someone who's working within to deepen the resources within these shelters and all of that. So, but I agree. I think it makes, like, everything that you're saying makes total sense. And in the interest of time, because I have so many more status quo practices, I'm going to move us to the next one, which is
be quiet.
No, don't be quiet. It's just there's so much to cover, and I want to make sure I get a quick reaction. I think we've talked about this one on the first episode, but just measurement, right? Like, a lot of nonprofits not looking in the mirror versus like the future of, hey, we got to track and improve. And I think in what I remember and what has stuck with me from our first conversation in the episode about this is, like, there is an ethical responsibility to be looking in the mirror and to measure the programs and to invest in the continuous improvement. Is it actually doing what we intend to do? And if not, like, how do we upgrade our approach?
Yes, that hasn't changed. And I actually been thinking a lot about this in at this time of year because of the conversations I've had. And I'll do this really quickly because you've captured everything what I really feel about this already. As I've been having conversations with folks about how their year-end giving is going, I am struck by the fact that we are in 2022 and people still are not tracking their fundraising efforts. So they have no idea how the segmentation of their donor base went last year, for example, in terms of return. Were they able to move up that top tier to being higher levels or whatever it is? I don't need to give you the examples, but I am just dumbfounded by the number of folks who don't pay attention and aren't looking at the return, if you will. And I don't, on the different methods that they're trying. They're trying different fundraising methods. They're debating who to reach out to with a paper, who to reach out with electronically, who to reach out with a phone call, but then they're not collecting the results of that data. So next year they're going to be in the exact same boat. And the only thing they're going to have to rely on is what somebody vaguely remembers. And so yes, paramount tracking programs, absolutely, bringing in that data so you can always improve. But there are other pieces, most notably fundraising, that we need to be tracking and doing, et cetera, et cetera. Okay.
Love that.
Come on.
Yes. That there's a whole status quo dedicated to just what you said as well. So I that's helpful for me to kind of draw some of the connections there. All right, moving from measurement to fundraising diversification. This one I'm getting feedback that there's of course there's no one size fits all, but the point is that fundraising shouldn't be a one source funding path, and that you should really try to not put all your eggs in one basket as a nonprofit. So, statistically, I know that like individual giving from online donations only accounts for about 10 to 20% of a nonprofit's budget. So that's not a huge piece of the pie, but it's an important piece. And there are many nonprofits that are either fully government, like grant funded, or many nonprofits that are fully reliant on a or a number of major gift donors for their operations. So the point here being moving from like a one source or a very limited source funding model to something that's more diversified.
Sustainability is absolutely, financial sustainability is absolutely tied to diversification of income strategies. We just cannot, survive. And I've been saying this for a good dozen years, if not more. We can't survive on one kind of income. We can't survive on one source of one kind of income. And, what I don't understand is where people have been for the last 10 years watching foundations, which tends to be people's highest source of funds, unless, as you said, those who are government funding tend to be 90 to 95% government funded, and you're not going to talk them out of it because the government has always been there. But those that have been overly dependent upon foundations have watched foundation after foundation after foundation switch its funding priorities, and whole programs disappear. So I don't know how much more evidence people need that reliance on one or even two sources of funding is not the path forward for financial sustainability. But I think this ties into people's failure to look at the future, that they're so focused, and this is what happens with a scarcity mindset. You're so focused on today and tomorrow or this month's payroll that you're not doing the visioning, the thinking about down the road. And if we want to have it down the road, we need to have diversified income sources, a diversity of income sources, yes. From foundations to corporations to government, which most people don't have, to individuals to earned income.
Right. Well, that one seems to hit pretty clearly. I don't know what else needs to be said. I mean, maybe
I'm trying to be concise here.
No,
unlike
this is
going
helpful.
on, Julia. So
well, I'll tell you one insight from my episode with Rashida Peterson and Anna Barber, career nonprofit fundraisers, worked for small, large, massive nonprofits. One of the pieces of advice they gave me is like, it is not good advice to tell a nonprofit to go after everything, and that you feasibly can't do that. Right. But it is good to have your priorities set of like, here's my number 1, 2, and 3. Have a 2 and a 3 instead of just that one. And many fundraising strategies that they're advising are not to say, here's the entire ecosystem of what you could go after, go get it all, but to have a plan to kind of go after the right priorities based on so many factors, like what's your likelihood of winning that, and what share of the overall pie is going to come from that. And
scattershotting does not work in fundraising. Being very intentional and strategic does.
Yes, as is the case with startup fundraising, I'm learning. So sustainability, we talked about this. This is very important for the diversification of funds. Sustainability is kind of the undercurrent. But I think, and this comes into another status quo I'm going to get to, but like moving from this idea of nonprofits are just expenses only, like you give us money, we're going to spend it, but shifting to something more sustainable, revenue generating, right? And I'm really inspired by many of the guests that I'm hosting on the Nonprofit Lab have sustainable fundraising strategies, ways to actually generate some kind of revenue from either the services that they're providing or like other creative ways of actually turning this large lump of a donation into a long-term trajectory of actually returning more revenue to the organization. So
this goes back to where we started. If you have a sustainability mindset, if you have a scarcity mindset, you're not worrying about the future. It is day to day to day. One of the books that had the greatest impact on me when I was in college was a book about the poverty, the culture of poverty. That's what it was called, actually, the culture of poverty. It talks about that culture of poverty that doesn't save, that doesn't plan for the future, that doesn't invest in tomorrow because they're not sure tomorrow is going to come. And if your mantra is, will we make payroll next month? You're not worrying about sustainability. Sustainability becomes, can we get to next month? Not, what is our plan for being financially strong and vibrant 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And so, this whole notion of revenue generating, this whole notion of earned income isn't something that folks in a scarcity mindset can get to and wrap their heads around. So,
right.
I've read some things that have said that earned income is going to become the number one source of income for nonprofits within the next, well, I don't know when I read it, so we'll just say 5 to 10 years. I don't think that's going to happen, but I think it has to become a bigger part of a lot of nonprofits' diversified income strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is what makes this particular status quo and the shift so difficult, because you don't have the capacity to be forward thinking in the future if you are worried about putting, as someone who's consulted in health and human services, putting food on the table.
Exactly.
That's your priority, and it is a privilege to even be able to have the space to think about the week or a month ahead, and when you're in that situation. So this one's tough, because how do you empower, enable someone who is in that situation and in that scarcity mindset? Maybe it's just more awareness around and more conversations about it, but I'm not sure exactly what the action could be for someone who is very deeply rooted in a situation where the scarcity mindset around fundraising and sustainability is just kind of crippling them into that position.
It's just so interesting, not surprising, but it is so interesting how so many of these status quo things feed onto one another.
Mm-hmm.
So that struggling nonprofit would be who's really, really sunk in the scarcity mindset to the point that they are thinking, will we make payroll next week? That's the one who needs to go out and find a good collaborator to work with, maybe eventually to merge with, but we're not talking about that, just to work with, to try to give them some of that space. But, to your point, if you are really stuck with treading water and, trying to make it to next week, you're not going to be thinking about next year. And so even thinking about sustainability is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if we have to, so when I think about the notion of collaboration, revenue generation, diversification, it all goes back to, how do we get people to understand that scarcity is not what's expected? And abundance isn't what's expected, because people start to get nervous when they have too much. Just trying to talk to nonprofits about the importance of having a reserve fund. Oh, well, if a funder sees us with $50,000 in our reserve fund, which is 2 months of operating costs, they're not going to fund us. Hell, it's 2 months of operating costs. Of course, they're going to be interested in funding you. But this is how that scarcity mindset works. We got to be dirt poor. And it's so interesting to me. I'm going to have to go back and reread Culture of Poverty. Now, I mean, having brought it up, I've never thought about it in this context, but you're hitting so many of the status quos that relate to the elements of a culture of poverty for human beings. it's even more than what that 2009 article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review talked about, that I'm absolutely blanking on its title. I never thought I would. It's deeper than that. It's deep seated. And then I wonder what happens, and I'm going off and then I'll stop. So many nonprofits that are started by people who came out of the problem that they're addressing, are they carrying forth unwittingly, because, people in the culture of poverty don't, it's like people in the trauma who have been trauma informed aren't aware of the ACEs that have put them in this position unless they've done a lot of self-reflection. But I wonder how much the people who, the fact that so many people who started nonprofits, not all of them, obviously, came out of a scarcity mindset as human beings, as growing up, that this is part of what helps its perpetuation.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who grew up in semi-poverty and like grew up with a scarcity mindset around finances and so many other things, I can personally relate to that challenge as a founder and having to like face a lot of these issues. And from my own personal experience, it is doing a lot of that self-reflection, sure, but then it's also like raising your hand and asking for help and guidance around that, because it is really damn hard to do it all by yourself. And I think that's where maybe as the sector as a whole can like set the standard around, hey, if you're a new nonprofit founder, or if you're thinking about starting a nonprofit, like this earned income piece of your operation should be something like you really think about. And if you're not familiar with that, like here's a number of resources or organizations that specialize in kind of like that strategic thinking. So I think that resourcing, guidance, like mentorship type perspective could also be really helpful and important on this front, but very, very difficult. The other anecdote I'll share is, coming back to Stacey saying when at Finability, most of their staff and volunteers are themselves victims of like the domestic violence, and are like their lived experience in that sense is actually one of the greatest assets that they have in terms of serving the people. But we're specifically right now talking about like operation, like nonprofit, like management and operations, which is a little different than like the actual service and kind of day to day of like providing those services from that perspective. So this one's tough.
Yeah.
I'm going to move us to this one. Organizational focus, moving from a money centric to an impact centric. So this was interesting because I initially had this as donor centric to impact centric, and someone was like, no, you really do want to keep the focus on the donor relationship. That's really important. What we want to shift away from is going after people's pocketbooks and seeing people as walking checkbooks, to like building a community, building the buy-in, helping people see the impact of their contribution, and helping people feel and see that they are part of something bigger than themselves. So this narrative around like the organization's focus internally being, we got to get this money, to like, this is what we're doing and here's what we need to accomplish it, is I think kind of the shift in the status quo that, I think might need to, there's room for it to happen.
Well, I think it's a necessity, because if we become impact centric, then theoretically, and I believe it's more than theoretical, it will become easier to get the money that we need. But when we go to people and say, just give me money, and we just put our hand out and we've got no data on the impact. We've got no, the best we can offer is one or two anecdotal stories, which are nice, but, we want to see the numbers. We have to become impact centric, because it's part of what is going to allow us to get the money, and to get the right money.
Yeah. And the like, it also helps shift the conversation from like me, like and us, to like the mission and what the organization is doing and the people that they're serving. So this one's pretty straightforward. So I'll just keep it going if that's okay with you. Fundraising skills. So we talked about the professionalization of the nonprofit sector, just even having a major in being able to nonprofit leadership management. These are all relatively new things. So still there's this fundraising skills gap, and most people at nonprofits, it seems like, are just told to go raise money without any former training or skills. And they're, moving from this figuring it out kind of world of fundraising to having the resources and knowledge and the networks to take more proven approaches. Thoughts on kind of the fundraising skills gap, and and I think the other challenge here is hiring a development director that knows what they're doing is really expensive.
Yeah.
So yeah, just curious for your thoughts on this shift of that needs to happen in the sector as well.
There's no question about this, and the need for it. Let me put it that way. Probably the biggest area of research in the sector from the last 20 years has been the research on what works in fundraising. Why do men give? Why do women give? Why do boomers give? Why do Generation Z and X give? Why do Southerners give? Northerners give? And whites, blacks, purples, you name it. I mean, there is so much. I was just going over a class that I teach that I'm going to be teaching in the spring, and there's a whole section on fundraising research. And every time I teach this class and I have to build out that section, I am overwhelmed with the amount of research that is available so that you can design a multifaceted, a multidimensional targeting approach. Will it take time? Absolutely. Does somebody need to read the research? Absolutely. Is it readily available? Absolutely. But instead, as you said, we throw people in. I don't know, because I've never done this and I've never seen the research on this, but I will tell you that I'm easily 80% of the folks in development that I know didn't start out saying, I want to be a development professional. They got thrown into development. They were looking for a job in the nonprofit sector. And, outside of that entry-level direct service program tier in the org chart, one of the greatest areas of turnover is in the development office. So you want to get your foot in the door in a nonprofit, you become a development lackey. And, because there's so much turnover in those divisions, you move up quickly. Suddenly you're, so we throw people into it. And, if they're lucky, they work in a very sophisticated development office. Most of them don't. And they have to figure it out themselves, and nobody tells them that there are classes that they can take, that there's research out there, that we need to be blah 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 blah. And I don't think there are already places where the vice president for development or the vice president for advancement or whatever that position is called is getting paid more money than the executive director, CEO, because for that, as you said, for that really skilled, smart, successful fundraising professional, it's worth all the money there is. Mm-hmm. Again, that's that ROI question.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So why don't we take advantage of the fact that we know now, we've got this growing body of research. We've got this growing group of fundraising professionals. Why aren't we taking advantage of them? We wouldn't say, hey, we need a building built. We'll hire you. Go figure out how to build it. Who would think about doing that? And the classic one, you don't go to a plumber to have your teeth pulled.
Yes, like all of I love how you highlighted just the wealth of research knowledge, everything that's available. I think the other factor to this, from my conversations with fundraisers, is just doing it, right? Like being comfortable with rejection and kind of building the thick skin that it can take to be a development officer, and like making your first major gift ask, and having a safe arena where you can cultivate and practice and build and hone all of these skills, because you could read all the books and research and everything. That's really helpful. It'll give you a direction, but it's a whole nother ballpark like to do it. Yeah. So having like a culture of like that supports that kind of growth mindset, and like that it's okay, like, hey, I know that last meeting didn't go so well, but we're in this together. I think culturally, I think would be helpful, instead of just pinning the role of fundraising on an individual and being like, well, where's the money? What's taking so long?
But that goes back to an earlier contrast of, bowling alone and collaboration. I don't want to share my secrets, because then you might get the money and I won't get the money. And it's just and what I try to tell people is that it's unlikely that some other nonprofit has the exact same pool of potential donors as you do, and share, learn from one another.
Yes. Well, here's another one that might make you go, another status quo is this donor focus and really nonprofit focus on overhead, as well as you sink back into your chair. So how do we go from this overhead focus to like, okay, maybe we should understand the number, like what goes into that, but what's more important is actually the mission delivery. Like, what is that getting us? And I think in our first episode, you mentioned that like some donors are in a position of just looking at this ratio of overhead to program spend, and like without going any further, just either dismissing a nonprofit for that. So are you seeing any shifts in this conversation, this trend? I know since we last talked, or is it still very much the same?
Yeah, people are afraid. They're not willing to risk the loss of money to fight the battle, to say, hey, look, our overhead may appear high to you, but this goes back to the return. This is the return that we're getting. And this is why our overhead is high this year, whatever the heck high means. But as long as we are beholden by a false number, or beholden to a false number, because people don't really know their true costs, their true overhead costs, we're going to push ourselves back into that scarcity mindset. Because if we have to, in order to get funders to give us money, we have to meet their skimpy allowance for spending on overhead, we're never going to be sustainable. And I know I keep saying this, but I think there are some basics that we need to correct before we can move away from some of these other status quo positions. That I just think they're too intertwined.
Yes.
And I think this is evidence of the nonprofit sector having been co-opted by funders that allowed us to focus on overhead rather than focusing on impact, mission delivery,
Right.
The success of what's important and why we came into existence. We didn't come into existence to keep our overhead low any more than we came into our existence to make a lot of money and become wealthy. We came into existence, and this I totally believe for 99% of the people working in the nonprofit sector, we came into existence, we chose this sector because of the mission work, not because of overhead, not because of all this other crap. And yet we allowed ourselves to become co-opted to pay more attention to that than to what we're supposed to be paying attention to.
Yeah. And I think the biggest like wake up call around this conversation for overhead is, if we're considering the people who are actually running the nonprofit and delivering these services, the actual heartbeat of the organization, as quote unquote overhead, right, and that being kind of an obstacle, like whoa, hold on, can we have a conversation about this? Can we revisit this? So Well, we've covered a lot, and can you believe I have more? I'm gonna I'm gonna keep it going. The next couple kind of go together. So what I'm gonna do is speak to this one and then go to the next one. So personalization, specifically with like, and you talked about this, right? Tracking donor relationships and like using these generic like emails or just like a text message blast. There's like no thoughtfulness that goes into some of the messaging. So how do we become more personalized with that communication? And technology, I think, is a big backbone of that. So I'll move from the personalization status quo to the digital maturity piece, and maybe we can talk about both things as well, like going from these manual spreadsheets and like paper notes that we have about donors and relying on the anecdotal memory of someone who had that conversation with a major gift donor like 4 months ago. How do we go from manual spreadsheets to thoughtful automation and keeping that personalization in mind? So, I've said this a few times, but like having worked for, Fortune 500 companies, private sector, consulting for government, and now being like very deep into the nonprofit sector, there's like government is about 10 years or so behind the private sector, and then I'm seeing nonprofits is like another 5+
Yeah.
years behind
Yeah.
government. So what are your thoughts on kind of digital maturity and like the importance of personalization and outreach?
I think this is one area where we are seeing shift, but it's a divide. We still talk about the digital divide. I'm not sure what the right language is, but I think there are those who get it and those who don't, the have and the have nots when it comes to here. Though even the haves are not as technologically advanced. I remember a year ago having a conversation with people and suggesting that I'd read this fascinating article about written by an AI guru. I've forgotten who it was, but if I were to remember his name and I said it to anybody who knows anything about AI, they would bow down and, kiss his feet kind of things. And he talked about the use of bots. And I thought, well, why aren't we in our sector using bots? There are so many of these kind of routine things that we have on a daily basis with people that if we freed up human time and put it over to a bot, we would save a lot of human resource time that could be used other places. And I remember getting such resistance, but we like to be human and we like to have that personal touch. How many of us have had a conversation with a bot when we're buying something or, trying to talk to our bank or whatever? And where a bot can help saves a tremendous amount of time as the consumer. If I'm willing to do it as a consumer, why can't, people be willing to do it if it's going to get them the services they need from a nonprofit faster? No, 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 no. So we're not yet ready to use really advanced technology, even in those organizations that were advanced. There was the Jewish Museum. It wasn't the Jewish Museum. I've forgotten what museum it was here several years ago. Did a virtual reality tour of living in oh my God, what do we call them? Where immigrants.
Refugee camps?
Refugee camps. All I could come up with was immigrant jail, which is what it feels like to me. But they took you on a virtual reality tour of living in an immigrant camp. And it was just the most powerful thing. And the cost of virtual reality has come down. And there are so many nonprofits who could benefit from telling their story through virtual reality kinds of, live for 24 hours in virtual reality kind of stuff. And I haven't seen it replicated anywhere else. So as I said, there's this divide. And so, but even those that are advanced aren't terribly advanced, but it goes back to, again, the scarcity mindset. To do this, would it have to invest in new technology, new software, training people to do this? And what we have is working. Why should we change it? There's that mindset too. What we've always done is just fine. Where you do see the divide goes back to the personalization. I think as the younger generation has come into the workforce, understanding social media so much better than the rest of us, older folk, this notion of having to be customized, personalized, one size doesn't fit all, has finally made it through in marketing and in fundraising. Not across the board, but that's again where I go, there is still this divide.
Well, it's great to hear from you, and I'm seeing this as well. Like, one of the fastest shifts is happening in this space, and a lot of companies are innovating. And I think that example of the bot that you gave is a really clear, direct example of where there could be a lot of additional utility and power, but there's still like some reluctance to that, and it's totally understandable, right? But I think
No, is it?
I
I don't understand it. How come younger people? I don't understand. What's the hesitancy? Anyway, doesn't matter. We don't need to go there. That's not what you asked me for.
No, that's a good question. Like my CEO brain is saying I want to get on a call with my CTO and my CEO and come up with some use cases and like, hey, maybe this is something we think about for our roadmap. All right, this is the last one.
Okay.
And this came up first. Like, this is one of the first things that we talked about was like, and I see the strap line here is different, the text, but purpose driven. Like, nonprofits are purpose driven businesses, right? This notion of nonprofits being like no profit is totally wrong. And I think like there's a big shift that's happening in the nonprofit sector around like the acknowledgement of this. I think I remember you in the first episode saying like when you brought this up in like a room, like at like how, and you asked people to raise their hand around like understanding this concept that very few did, and now you're seeing way more hands come up. I'm also seeing, I think there's a bigger gap in this understanding for donors. To understand like, oh, wait, nonprofits can generate revenue. Like, wait, nonprofits can pay their staff like living wage, not just the living wage, but like a competitive wage. Like, it's shifting from this charity mindset around how nonprofits run to more of this business mindset. And here we are again talking about ROI, like another kind of connection point to this one. But thoughts on kind of this shift between charity mindset to business
It
mindset?
is happening. There's no question about it. But I think it's happening in only a portion of the sector, and that's people who've been in the sector for a while. I think that people who start nonprofits start it with a charity mindset. Oh, I'm starting a nonprofit. I'm going to do good work. People are going to give me everything for free. And so until we can get people who are starting nonprofits to understand that they're starting a business and that they need to understand that business mindset and to shed as quickly as possible this charity mindset, that charity mindset is still going to be part of the sector. And I think it goes back also to what you said. People can say, yes, we're a business, but how much are they acting like a business? And I think the language has come faster than the behavior has come. And, there's a whole thing that we don't even know go into in sociology and psychology. Is the language lead the behavior lead the language kind of stuff. We don't need to go there, but I think that people have, oh yes, we are a business, but they haven't necessarily translated that fully into their actions, their activity, if they're in a leadership position, how they're running it. It is absolutely true that the vast majority of people who are starting a nonprofit have no understanding whatsoever that they are in fact starting a business. I think that if the donors got this, we'd no longer be worried about overhead. But we see folks from the business world who understand overhead the way overhead should be understood, I believe. Come on and sit on a nonprofit board and start worrying about our overhead being too high. And that just continues to perpetuate this notion of we're thinking about things wrongly, that we're a charity, we're a nonprofit, and we can't apply business principles and arguments. Fortunately, there are some folks from the business world who get that that's, hogwash and we're a business and, one's a mission-driven business and one's a money-driven business, but a business is a business is a business. It's shifting. But the behavior is slow to follow.
Yes, as with all of these different status quo practices. Well, objective mission, I don't want to say mission accomplished, but like objective accomplished for this call, because you really helped me put so much more color and context and understanding to why we are where we are, and more importantly, helped to position some of the things that need to happen, or the obstacles that we need to face as a sector or individually or as organizations to be part of this shift. And I think I'll just conclude by saying that it's like this everything that we just talked about is so much bigger than like me or you or like any individual organization. We're talking about the entire like 1.5, 1.8, whatever that number million nonprofits are right now, as well as the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going into the sector. Like, I'm hoping that this conversation at least is part of the awareness phase of these shifts that are happening, and hopefully adds fuel to the fire of change for some of these other things where we're further along. So I appreciate you listening and for being so generous with your experience and thoughts with all this stuff.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. I love how you frame this as the status quo and what the movement forward looks like. I think that can be a really valuable way of framing it for some people. And so I think that's a really nice way of doing it. And maybe it can help to wake folks up more when they see that this is how it is, but there is an alternative, and the alternative is the better alternative. I don't want to say right, but it is the right alternative, but it is, it's better, and that there are options. And I think, we all get so set in our ways and think that what we're doing is good and the best because we know it and we're comfortable with it. But yeah.
Well, the way this conversation went, I was planning on just sharing it with our co-founders, but I feel very inclined to just turn this into a podcast episode. Come on, it's like there's a lot of rich content here. So I might have to send you another podcast release form, Laura.
Okay, we can do that.
Well, Laura, thanks for your time again. This was incredible.
My pleasure. Always.
Right.
I enjoy it no end.
Likewise. Thank you. Take care.
You.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Well, that wraps up episode 13. One of our biggest focuses for this year is going to be spending more time unpacking each one of these status quo practices and providing more actions for how nonprofits and donors can break through. So be sure to like, subscribe, follow, share, rate the Nonprofit Lab on whatever platform you're listening on. It means a lot to us. As always, we'll end on a quote. Here's the quote to close this episode out. This one from the most legendary Stoic Roman emperor and philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, who said, "Observe constantly that all things take place by change, and accustom yourself to consider the nature of the universe loves nothing so much as to change the things which were and to make new things like them." With that, here's a big cheers for change, for positive change in the nonprofit sector. Thanks for tuning in to another episode. We appreciate you listening, and until next time, be well.